everybody, and welcome back to another video in our book tracking app course. And this course right now, we're essentially going through a bunch of different pieces of the Jetpack libraries and different concepts, and we're seeing how we can combine them all together to make an app that is actually useful for something that looks like a modern application. So if you're just joining us and you need the code for this video, you can get that down in the link in the description below. And otherwise, if you've been following along this whole time, you can simply just use your code that you already have from the previous video. So in this video, we're going to be briefly looking at a design pattern called Model-View-ViewModel, which is commonly known as MVVM, which is essentially referred to it in this video. And let me just draw you a picture here just to get started. So within MVVM, you are going to have two different layers. Our first layer is going to be called our presentation layer. And then our second layer is going to be called our data layer. And basically, just like the names imply, the data layer is going to be responsible for handling and retrieving and storing and caching all of the data. And the presentation layer is going to be in charge of presenting all of that data to the user. Now, within our presentation layer, we're going to have a couple different things. The first I'm going to draw here is known as our view. So typically, let's make that the view. And then this has traditionally been a XML plus activity, or in our case, this is going to be our composable functions plus activity. And then after the view, we are going to have one more piece inside of our presentation layer. And this is going to be known as our view model. So if you've been following along, hopefully you are already familiar with these terms, view and view model. And our view model is essentially going to be used to track our UI state. So I'm going to put one more box inside of our view model. We're going to label this UI state. So basically, what's going to happen here, we're going to observe this UI state from our view. So I'm going to draw a line to there, and basically all we're doing here is observing. And then after that, there's one more thing that our view can do, actually send to our view model, and that is the any UI actions that happen that our view model need to be represented in our state. We're going to go ahead and send those over from the view. So sends UI actions. And that's pretty much what the view is going to do. Now the view model is going to basically it's going to take the data that it gets from our data layer. So we're getting data from the data layer. And what the view model is going to do, the view model is going to prepare all of that data for presentation. So also within the view model, you have your state and you also have your presentation logic. Now within the view, you have your XML or composables, but you also have within the view your data logic. The only thing that's missing here is what is in the data layer. You're going to have a couple different things within the data layer. We'll draw one box there, and then one box beneath that. So this top box is going to be our API reference. And then this bottom box is going to be our room database data access object. And then both of these are going to go inside of something else that we actually haven't created in our app yet, and we're going to make that in this video. So this right here for now is just going to be our mystery class. And then the only other thing that we're missing in here is going to be your what's known as our data logic. So all of your data logic is going to go in your data layer. Your presentation logic goes in your view model layer, and then your whoops, I said data logic there too. Your UI logic goes in your view, also in the presentation layer. So the view is going to observe the UI state from the view model, and then it's going to also send UI actions to the view model. The view model is going to get the data from our data layer and then prepare that for presentation. And the data layer is going to get the data from our network call using our API, or potentially from our room database using our data access object. And just one note I'll make here, this view model, when I say view model, and I'm talking about MVVM architecture, which is what this is, MVVM, this could be any view model. This doesn't necessarily refer to our Jetpack view model that we've been using. Now, of course, in our app, we are using our Jetpack view model, and this has some limitations because this view model actually exposes some Android APIs, such as save state handle, which is good if you need to use that, but it's bad if you're trying to create cross-platform projects, such as like a Kotlin multi-platform mobile KMM project. But that is way too complex for this video and is a whole nother course. So we're not going to talk about that. Just know that this view model in this architecture, we could be using any type of view model for that. But let's actually get back to Android Studio now and look at our book tracking app and see what we need to do to make this fit an MVVM pattern. So I'm actually going to add just a little bit of functionality here to demonstrate what a mistake in MVVM would look like. If I load my app here, for a brief second I get just a white screen, and then finally it comes into here. Now that's not a very good user experience, especially if we're not connected and our database is empty. Basically it's going to open up a white screen and leave it there. So I want to put a loading bar there. So let's go ahead and do that. Open up your book screen, and within here I'm going to add, under my view model, I'm going to say val books equals view model dot state dot value. So this, I'm basically reading the value from the view model state, the UI state, and I'm storing it in my books. And then down here in our items, instead of using view model state dot value, I'm just going to pass it that books variable that we created. And then next, I need to actually determine when it is that we want to show a loading circle here. So at a first glance here, let's say if our book list is empty, then we should be loading. Let's add an isLoading variable to our book screen. So in here, we can say var isLoading equals, and I'm just going to set that equal to books.isEmpty. Now, whenever our books arrive from the database or the server, our state.value is no longer going to be empty, which means that when this recomposes, our books is no longer going to be empty, and this isLoading is going to evaluate to false. So if isLoading is true, then we definitely want to display our loading circle, but if it's not, then we want to keep it hidden. So to do this, what I'm going to do down here, this whole lazy column, I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to stick it inside a box. And then after that lazy column now, I'm going to add just if isLoading. And if it is loading, we're just going to do a circular progress indicator and run our app again. And now, oh, you see you get a little isLoading circle up in the corner. So let's fix that within our box. We don't want that in the corner. we want that right in the middle. So I'm going to do content alignment equals alignment dot center, and then we're going to do modifier equals modifier dot fill max size. Now let's try that again. Okay, you can see now we do get that progress circle indicator, but let's go ahead and turn off our internet and our Wi-Fi connection here. So now we have no data coming to this phone. It'll still work because we're going to pull from our room database that we use to cache this. But if I simply delete this application from my phone, which you can also dig into the settings and clear all the app's data. But for now, we're just going to actually delete that application from our phone and click the run again, which will reinstall it on my phone. And now here you go. You see I get the spinning circle loading indicator, and it doesn't go away. We have two different issues here. First, our view has presentation logic in it, but it really should only have UI logic. And what I mean by it has presentation logic is we have this isLoading variable here, which we're setting, of course, is to books is empty. But this isLoading variable is allowing my composable to determine its own state. And if you remember from our diagram, the UI state actually belongs within the view model, not within the composable itself. So this needs to go to the view model to get rid of that. And then the second issue that we have is essentially our view model itself has some, it's supposed to only have presentation logic, but we definitely have data logic within the view model. You could see if you go down to like refresh cache is making an API call using retrofit, and it's also making database calls. So both of those are definitely data logic. So we need to separate that out. So the first thing that we're going to do here to make this fit an MVVM architecture is we're going to take our isLoading variable, which we said is our presentation logic, and we are going to get that moved on over to the view model. But to do that, we need to put somewhere in here, we need to have a state that holds both our list of books and our isLoading variable. So to do that, we're going to come over here, we're going to do new Kotlin class or file, and this is going to be called a books screen state, and this is actually going to be a data class. Now within this book screen state, we're going to have val books, which is a list of type book, and after that we're going to have an isLoading, which is just going to be a Boolean variable here. And once we have that, I need to come back to my view model and change the state. Instead of being a mutable list of empty list book, essentially we need to change this to a mutable list of that state class that we just created. So books screen state, and then within that books screen state we have our books list, which is going to be a list of and then just empty. And then we are going to set our isLoading equal to true, because initially when our list is empty, we know that we should be loading. Now we need to go update our getBooks function down here, because you see we're trying to set our state to our old data type for our state. So this now needs to be state.value equals state.value.copy, and then what's going on? Whoops, just one equal sign. So equals state.value.copy, books equals books, and then isLoading, because we know at this point we've loaded, we're going to set isLoading equal to false. So now we're updating our list of books and we're setting our isLoading flag to false. But next we need to look back in our toggle finished function, because you'll see down here we also have some errors because we're using our state down there as well. So we need to upgrade that. So this is going to be state.value.books.toMutable list. and that's going to fix that part. But then down here in our state.value, we're just saying updated books. But again, this needs to be state equals state.value.copy books equals updated books. So now all of our presentation logic is contained within our view model itself. So let's go back to the UI to update that. So come back into the book screen, and we have this isEmpty variable that we no longer need. So we can delete that. Then I'm going to take this books and I'm just going to rename that to state, because that's the state that we're observing and retrieving from our view model. Now down below where it says books in red, this needs to be state.books, because books is now one of the variables contained within our state. And the same thing with isLoading. This needs to be state.isLoading. Run the app. And there we go. You could see that, well, we fixed one thing, right? Our circular progress indicator from down there, that went away, so that's good. But it would also be nice if we had an error message that we could display here. So go back on over to your book screen state. And inside of that class, I'm going to add another variable in there, val error, which is going to be of type just a nullable string. And we're going to set that initially to null because we have no error. And then when that's not null, we'll know that we have an error. Now we can update this value inside of our book view model's error handler. So come on over to your book view model and going up to the top, find that error handler that you have. And inside this, we're going to print the stack trace, and we're also going to say state.value equals state.value.copy. And then inside of that, we're going to do error equals e.message, and then isLoading. We're going to set that equal to false as well, because if we have an error, we know we're done trying to load. So let's go down and update our getAllBooks function to use this error. I'm going to change this error here to no data to display to no data from Firebase. And then after that, we're going to say if, and then books DAO dot get all dot is empty. Because if we're checking if that's empty, well, if our get all from the DAO is empty, that means that our HTTP exception failed, or our HTTP request failed, and now our database call failed as well. So what we want to do in here actually is we're going to write another log statement, and I'm going to say no data from local cache. And then after that, we're going to throw our exception here. So throw exception error device offline and \n for a new line, no data from local cache. So one more thing here, because we're checking here if our get all from our DAO is going to be empty, we no longer need this line there. And this indent isn't quite right, so let's indent that. And then we need to add, just like we did for our isLoading in the book screen, we need to add in here just another if statement. So if state.error is not equal to null, well then in that case we're going to have a text field in here, and in that text field we are just going to say state text equals state.error and font size equals 30 SP, just to make that big enough to read. Now let's run that one more time. And you can see now that loading indication goes away and it's updated our screen with an error so that we know something's gone wrong and this is not going to work. And if we turn that Wi-Fi back on now, relaunch our app, you can see we get the loading bar, and then there's our list of books. Okay, so now basically we have our presentation logic and our UI logic separated, but we still need to separate our presentation logic from our data logic. So right now we have data logic in the view model, which I showed you earlier, but I'll show you again. Essentially right here where we're using our books DAO object, and then down here in this refresh cache, and pretty much anywhere where we're pulling from our API or our books DAO, those are both data logic functions, and that's things that should be in our data layer rather than in our view model. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new class. So right click on here, new Kotlin class or file, and this is going to be our books repository. And then what we're going to put inside of this books repository, go on back to your view model, and we're going to take this API variable. So cut that, and then back to your repository, paste it in there. And then we also need all the initialization logic for that, which is pretty much all of this. Cut that out of your init block, and then come back to the books repository, and we're going to set that equal to, get rid of these extra variables that we have padded in here. We don't need those anymore. And there we go. That is our API declaration for a books repository. Do the same thing with your DAO. So go ahead and cut your DAO and put it in your books repository as well. Come back to your view model. Instead of having both of those, we're just going to have a private val repo, which is of type books repository. So now come down here, and we're going to take our get all books function, our refresh cache, and then also our toggle finish DB function, which is this bottom one. Pretty much anything that's marked red right now. And I'm going to bring it on over to my repository, paste it in there. And then back here, we want that toggle finish DB function as well. Bring that one to the repository here as well. And for this toggle finish DB, we're going to make that public. So take away that private modifier, and the same thing here. Take away that private modifier. This, oh, sorry, not that one. Take away the private modifier and get all books. And then refresh cache, we're only going to call from our get all books function. So that should work. And now the only thing that we have left to do is go back over to your books view model, and you'll see that our get all books and then our toggle finished DB function calls are both showing errors right now. And that's because we don't know where to find those functions, because we moved them out of our view model class into our books repository class. But we still maintained this repo variable that is a reference to our books repository class within our view model. So all we need to do is we need to add repo dot in front of both get all books and then also in front of toggle finish DB. And that's pretty much it. Now our view model is only handling our presentation logic here, and our repository class that we created is going to be handling all of our data logic and our database calls as well as our network calls. Now let's go ahead and do that same thing for the book details view model as well. So what we need to do is go new Kotlin class or file, and we're going to make that book details screen state class, just like we made the books screen state class. We're going to make a new one here, book details screen state, and this one's going to be a data class. Now inside of this data class, we're going to have 3 different values. So val book, which is going to be of type book, and that's nullable. And then val is loading is going to be a Boolean. And then val error, which is going to be a nullable string that we have initially set to null. And once we have that, what we need to do is go on over to our book details view model. And inside of our book details view model, this state variable we need to update here. So instead of having mutable state of book, we need to do a mutable state of book details screen state. So book details screen state. And then in there, we're going to set our book equal to null because we don't have a book when we load that. And then is loading is going to be equal to true. And error is, of course, going to default to null because that's what we defaulted it to. Next, down below, we need to change our state updates down here. So we can't do state.value equals books.get anymore. We need to do state value equals state.value.copy. And then we need to say books equal, or book rather, equals bookDAO.get ID. And then same thing down here, the state.value equals state.value.copy book equals booksDAO.get book ID. So now if we go back over to book details screen, in here, we've got a couple things we need to update in here as well. So let's go ahead and remove the book variable. We don't want that anymore. Instead, what we're going to have is just a state. So val state equals ViewModel dot state dot value. And then after that, anywhere down below where you have a reference to book, this needs to be state dot book. State dot book. State, not comma, state dot book, and then state dot book title, state dot book genre, and finally state dot book series. And then after that, we're going to take this entire if statement here. I'm going to cut that out, and I'm going to make another box here, just like we did in our other screen. And then paste all of that within the box. Now, after that, if state.book is not equal to null, I'm going to add another if statement down here. And it's just going to say if state.is loading, well, then we're going to show our circle progress indicator. And then after that, if state.error does not equal to null, then we're going to display the text box with that error again. So text equals state.error and font size equals 30 SP. So one more thing, we don't just want a box without any alignment like we did last time. So I'm going to say content alignment equals alignment dot center. And then modifier is going to be our fill max width. So modifier dot fill max size rather. Let's go ahead and run that. And then we'll click on one of these and we get the loading. Oh, and actually it doesn't go away. Let's see. Going back over to book details view model. Yeah, so anytime we're updating our state now, we need to set our book, but we also, if we have a book, we want our is loading to be false. So make sure to update that as well on both of these. And let's try giving that one more run. So there you go. We got the loading on the details screen and then it went away. So now we've successfully implemented that loading screen without mixing our presentation and our UI logic. But still within our book details view model, you can see here, we definitely have with this books.dao.get and api.getBook this is certainly in books.dao.update, right? Like this is certainly data logic that we have within our presentation layer. So we need to separate that next. To do that, let's create a repository class, just like we did last time. So new Kotlin class or file. And this one we're going to name book details repository. Now in here, same thing as before, we want to go to our book details view model, and we're going to take our API and then also our books DAO. We're going to cut both of those, put them into our repository. Then we need to set this API equal to something. So find your init block in here, copy all of that code, cut that out, come back on over to your repository, paste that in there, and remove these extra variables that we no longer need. Okay, so now we have our API and we have our DAO. So back in the view model, same thing as before. We're going to say private val repo and set that equal to our book details repository. And then there's a couple functions down here. Well, pretty much all of these functions. We're going to take our refresh cache, our get book, and then also our get remote book. We're going to cut all of those, and we're going to move them on over to our book details repository. Once we've done that, we want to delete the private modifier on the get book function, but you'll notice that we still have a problem here. So in the last one that we did in our books view model and then in our books repository, we had our get books function neatly separated from our get all books function. But here I'm just using a view model scope inside of the get book function, and I'm setting the view model state directly instead of returning an object. So we need to separate this as well. Let's go ahead and rename our get book to get single book. And then let's start by making a new function in our books view model, or not our books view model, our books details view model. And that's going to be private fun get book, and this is going to take our ID. And then inside of that, we're going to launch our view model scope. So view model scope.launch, and I'm going to hand that my error handler as well. Now inside of that view model scope, we're going to say val book equals repo dot get single book ID, and then after that we're going to say state dot value equals state dot value dot copy book equals book and is loading equal to false. Okay, but you'll notice here oh whoops, that's not supposed to be an ID, that's supposed to be an int. And then now we have that get book and get ID, so that's good. But we still have a problem here, and we're getting this book from our get single book from our repository, but our get single book from our repository isn't returning anything. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we need to make it return a book. Then we're going to remove this view model scope.launch, and we are going to replace that with return with context, and our context is going to be dispatchers.io. And then down here, instead of doing state.value equals state.value.copy, what we're going to do instead is we're just simply going to say return at with context, and then booksDAO.getBookID, and same thing on this bottom line down here. And because we removed the coroutine launch from this function, we're going to need to launch this function from a coroutine. So let's make that a suspending function. And then after that, because we also added dispatchers.io to our get single book function, we can actually refactor our refresh cache code a little bit, and then we'll be able to simplify our code as well. So what we're going to do is up here, instead of calling our get remote book function that we have down here, which also is using dispatchers.io, well, we don't need to do that anymore. So in here, I'm going to say remote, well, not quite yet. First, we're going to say val map wrapper, which is just going to be a wrapper that we're going to unwrap, because if you remember, we get this map wrapper that we have to unwrap, which is just a integer that's paired with our book object, and we want to rip that integer off and just keep the book object. So we're going to say api.getBookID, and then after that, remote book is going to be map wrapper dot values dot first. And now that we have that all set up, we can go ahead and delete this get remote book function. We don't need that anymore. And that's basically it. So now our view model here as well is only handling our presentation logic, and then our book details repository class is going to be handling all of our data logic for this program. But actually, we still do have one error. Let's go look at that. Oh, make sure to put your parentheses whenever you're making a new class. Now we just have one more thing to fix, and this one may not be terribly obvious, so I'll just show you what it is. If you come back to your book screen, you'll remember I said that all of our presentation logic and then our UI logic was separated, and technically it's separated. We're not crossing any lines right now, but we could. And we don't like the ability, or we don't like the fact that we can. So right now in our book screen, we've got state equals viewModel.state.value. Well, this is a public, this is in fact a public variable. So I could come down here and say viewModel.state.value equals viewModel.state.value.copy, and then error equals error. And it's actually going to let me do that. So now I have, once again, my book screen, my composable function, setting the state for my UI. And obviously I wasn't doing that. And we don't want to do that, but we actually don't even want our composables to have the ability to do that. So luckily, Kotlin gives us a nice little feature here called, it's called a backing property. And essentially, it's going to allow us to mark an individual property as private, and then we're going to prefix it with an underscore and then use a public read-only variable to access that. So to do that, come on over to your book screen view model, and this state variable here, go ahead and right-click on that, and we're going to refactor, rename, and instead of state, we're going to rename that to underscore state. And then we're going to make that private. And because this is private, now obviously from our book screen, we are not going to be able to access that, but we'll fix that in a minute. So back in the view model, what we're going to do here now is we're going to make another variable, and we're going to say val state. And this one, instead of being mutable state, which a mutable state obviously means, because mutable means changeable, that means the state that we can change. This one is just going to be a state, and this one's just going to be a state, and it's going to be a book books screen state. And that is, we're going to put a getter on that. So get equals underscore state. Now, back in our book, back in our composable screen here, book screen, instead of setting that equal to val state equals viewModel.underscore state, what we're going to do is we're going to say val state equals viewModel.state.value. And now this state that we're reading is no longer a mutable state. So if I come down here and I try to run that same code, you can see I get an error and it says val cannot be reassigned, meaning my state variable that I have cannot be reassigned to a var. I can't change it because it's no longer a mutable state. So that is definitely what we want to do here, because what that means is now, obviously, because we took this course, we're smart enough to know not to do that. But what about your coworker or the guy that you're collaborating on this project with? Is he? Well, we definitely want to discourage that as best we can by not only not crossing the lines of presentation and UI logic, but we don't even want those lines to be available to be crossed. So now we're going to do that same thing within our book details screen. So in your book details view model, this state, we're going to make it private. And then we're going to right click on that. We're going to refactor, rename, and we're going to rename it to underscore state. And then we're going to introduce a new variable, val state of book details screen state. And this is going to be, this is going to be a state of book details screen state. And then we're going to use the same thing, get equals underscore state. So now we have a public read-only state variable that we can read from our composable function that's not mutable like this one. So our composable doesn't have the ability to change our actual state. It can only read the state. So the last thing we have to do now is come back on over to our composable function. And it's already done. Just make sure viewModel.state.value and not ._.state. So that's really all that we have, or that's really all that we have for this video. I'll go ahead and compile that and just make sure everything works fine. Hopefully you learned quite a bit along the way. You may have noticed one problem that we have building up over here. If you look in your project window now, you have just a ton of different files, and we have these all within the same package. So when I'm looking for a file, even at the end here, when I was looking for a file, it gets a little difficult to find it just at a first glance. So that's something that we're going to fix with clean architecture and learn about how to organize this and just separate these a little bit more and make a little more sense to us. So we're going to look at that in the next video, but hopefully in this video, you learned a little bit about separation of concerns and just a little bit about the MVVM architecture. So make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. As always, all the code from this video is down in the description, and we will see you in the next video.